The morning Lenora Langston walked into the Harlan County courthouse with a folded petition in her hand and fire in her dark eyes. Every man in that room knew the territory was about to change forever. It was the spring of 1882, and the New Mexico Territory was a place where water meant life and life meant everything. The Rio Seco River wound through the high desert like a silver thread stitched between ochre bluffs and sage-covered flats, and whoever controlled that thread controlled the fate of every homestead, every cattle operation, every kitchen garden for 40 miles in any direction. Lenora Langston had known this truth since she was a girl helping her father pull irrigation ditches by hand along the eastern edge of what would one day become the Langston family farm. She knew it the way she knew the smell of rain coming over the mountains, the way she knew the sound of her children sleeping in the next room, instinctively, bone deep, without question. She was 29 years old and had been a widow for 8 months. Her husband, Thomas Langston, had died in October of 1881, thrown from a horse during a dry drive when the animal spooked at a rattlesnake crossing a cracked riverbed. He had been 32 years old and full of plans. He had plans for a second well, plans for a new barn roof, plans for a trip to Santa Fe where Lenora had never been. Thomas was the kind of man who spoke about the future as though it were already waiting for him just over the next ridge, patient and inevitable. When they brought him home on the back of a wagon, his plans came home with him, unfinished and silent, and Lenora had held her 2 children against her chest in the doorway of their home and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water poured over her heart, that the plans now belonged to her. Their son, Caleb, was 7 years old, sharp-eyed and quiet, with his father's jaw and his mother's stubborn tilt to the chin. Their daughter, Mee, was 5, and she had not yet fully understood that her father was not coming back, which Lenora considered a mercy of the kind God occasionally offered to children that he withheld from their mothers. She did not tell Mee otherwise. She let the child believe what she needed to believe, and in the evenings when the fire burned low and the coyotes called from the mesa, Lenora sat alone at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic of survival on the back of whatever scrap paper she could find. The numbers were not favorable. Thomas had borrowed against the farm during a drought 2 summers prior, and the repayments had kept them thin but steady. Without his income from occasional cattle driving work for neighboring ranches, the margins vanished entirely. What they had was the land, the house, a mule named Aristotle who was older than Caleb and twice as stubborn, a vegetable garden that Lenora nursed with obsessive devotion, and access to a small diversion ditch that fed water from the Rio Seco onto their lower fields. That ditch was the margin between a working farm and a patch of dust. That ditch was everything. And in January of 1882, Harlan Driscoll sent a man to her door with a letter. Harlan Driscoll was the biggest name in the territory, and that was not a figure of speech. His name appeared on land grants, on courthouse documents, on the sides of supply wagons, and in the fearful silence of men who knew better than to say it too loud in the wrong company. He had come to New Mexico Territory in 1868 with capital from a St. Louis banking family and a talent for acquiring things that other people needed. He had built the Driscoll Water Concern, a company that held legal claims, some of them legitimate, many of them obtained through pressure and legal manipulation, over significant portions of the Rio Seco's diversion rights. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and accustomed to getting what he wanted before the other party fully understood they had been separated from it. The letter his man delivered to Lenora's door was politely worded. It informed her that a survey conducted on behalf of the Driscoll Water Concern had determined that the diversion ditch feeding the Langston property was in fact using water rights that belonged to the concern under a prior appropriation filing dated 1875. The letter further suggested that Mrs. Langston, given her difficult circumstances as a recent widow, might find it in her interest to negotiate a water lease arrangement with the concern at a rate of $12 per month, which would secure her access to the water she currently used without interruption. Lenora read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, set it in the tin box where she kept her important papers alongside Thomas's death certificate and the deed to their land, and walked out to the yard to look at the irrigation ditch that Thomas had dug with his own hands in the summer of 1876, one shovel at a time, sweating through 3 pairs of leather gloves before the channel was deep enough to run clean. $12 a month, for water that came from a river that God put in the ground. She did not think about it very long. She went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and began writing a petition to file water rights in her own name under the doctrine of prior appropriation, the legal principle that governed water use in the Western Territories, which held that whoever first put water to beneficial use had the superior right to that water. Thomas had been using that ditch since 1876. Harlan Driscoll's 1875 filing, she would later discover, covered a different diversion point 3 miles upstream, not the Langston property's point of diversion at all. The dates and locations did not match up. The legal claim was, at its core, a manufactured threat designed to frighten a grieving widow into paying for something she already owned. This was the piece of information that transformed Lenora Langston's grief into something with harder edges. She spent 2 weeks in the county record's office in the town of Culver, going through filed documents with the patient attention of a woman who had taught herself to read well and had spent years keeping the farm's accounts by hand. She read territorial water law by lamplight at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. She wrote letters to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe and received, eventually, a partial reply that confirmed the prior appropriation filing by the Driscoll Water Concern did not, in fact, encompass the Langston property's diversion point. She had the documentation to prove it. What she needed was a hearing. Securing a hearing before Judge Alton Wyeth of the Harlan County Circuit Court required a formal filing, which required a fee of $3.50 and the signatures of 2 property-owning citizens willing to certify that the claim was not frivolous. The $3.50 she had, barely. The signatures were harder. Every man she approached in the town of Culver listened to her explanation with a careful, respectful expression that meant he was thinking about Harlan Driscoll and not about the law. Robert Kinsley, who ran the dry goods store and had spoken well of Thomas at his funeral, told her he was sorry but he had a business to keep. Old Pete Morrow, who ran 40 head of cattle on land adjacent to the Langston property and had more reason than most to challenge the concern's water claims, looked at his boots for a long time and then said he had a family to consider. The banker, Marcus Webb, did not even let her finish speaking. She came home on a Thursday afternoon in March with no signatures and mud on her boots from the spring roads, and she stood in her kitchen and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed until the frustration settled back down below the surface where she could manage it. Caleb was watching her from the doorway with his careful eyes. He had developed a habit of watching her this way since his father died, measuring her the way a farmer measures the sky before a storm, looking for signs. "Are you all right, Mama?" he asked. "I am going to be," she told him, because it was the most honest answer she had. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd Friday of April, because Judge Wyeth, to his credit, had been willing to accept her filing on the basis of a single signature, her own, certified by the county clerk, after she explained the specifics of the case with enough precision and documented evidence that he could not in good conscience deny her the right to be heard. He was not a man inclined to favor Lenora Langston. He owed Harlan Driscoll a number of favors of the social and financial variety. But he was also a man who had been a lawyer before he was a judge, and something about the quality of Lenora's documentation gave him pause. So the hearing was set. and Culver buzzed with talk about it the way a beehive buzzes when something disturbs the comb, restless, agitated, a sound that could tip either way. Lenora arrived at the courthouse on that April morning wearing the black dress she had worn to Thomas's funeral, because it was the most formal garment she owned, and because she wanted every person in that room to understand exactly what was at stake for her. She had asked her neighbor, Clara Tillman, to watch the children for the morning. She carried her tin box of documents under her arm and her chin, at an angle that left no room for interpretation. The courthouse was a single-story adobe building on the main road through Culver, with 4 rows of wooden benches inside that could seat perhaps 30 people. On this morning, every bench was full, and men stood along the back and side walls. The presence of Lenora Langston versus the Driscoll water concern had attracted more spectators than anything the courthouse had seen since a cattle-rustling trial 3 years prior. Some of them were curious. Some of them had their own water grievances and were watching to see what happened when someone pushed back. Some of them were Driscoll's men, there to observe and to be seen observing, which was its own kind of pressure. Harlan Driscoll himself sat at a table on the left side of the room with 2 lawyers from Santa Fe whose suits cost more than Lenora's mule. They had leather briefcases and clean hands, and they arranged their papers with the deliberate efficiency of men who had done this many times before and knew how it ended. Lenora sat alone at the table on the right side of the room. She had no lawyer. She could not afford one, and the men who practiced law in Culver had all found reasons to decline her case. She had her documents and her knowledge of those documents and the steadiness that 8 months of widowhood and a lifetime of hard work had given her. She was frightened. She did not show it. It was as she was arranging her papers on the table, her back straight and her jaw set, that she became aware of a man sitting at the back of the room, not standing along the wall like the other late arrivals, but seated in the last row on the right, apparently having gotten there early enough to secure a place on the bench. She noticed him because he was watching her with an expression that was different from the expressions of everyone else in the room. The others looked at her with pity or curiosity or the guarded blankness of people who did not want to be associated with either side. This man looked at her with attention. The kind of attention that meant he was actually thinking about what he was seeing, not just watching. He was somewhere around 32 or 33 years old, she would have guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock the territory was made of. He wore a trail coat that was clean but worn at the cuffs, and a hat that sat on the bench beside him. He did not look like a lawyer. He did not look like a Driscoll man. He looked like a man who had been riding long enough that the country had gotten into him, settled behind his eyes like sediment in still water. She did not know who he was. There was no time to wonder about it. Judge Wyeth entered the room, and the hearing began. The Driscoll lawyers were methodical and polished. They entered their 1875 filing into evidence. They brought forward a surveyor named Alton Reed, recently hired by the concern, which Lenora had noted and prepared for, who testified that the diversion point serving the Langston property fell within the geographic scope of the concern's prior appropriation claim. They quoted territorial statute with fluid confidence. They spoke about economic development and the orderly management of water resources and the importance of clear legal title, and everything they said sounded reasonable if you did not look at the actual documents. Lenora looked at the actual documents. When Judge Wyeth gave her the floor, she stood up and she spoke. She was not a lawyer, and she did not speak like one, but she spoke like a woman who had spent 2 months reading every relevant document she could find, and who understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from personal necessity, exactly where the Driscoll claim fell apart. She pointed to the legal description in the 1875 filing and compared it, document by document, to the surveyor's plat she had obtained from the Territorial Land Office. The diversion point referenced in the Driscoll filing was at a location known locally as Cotter's Bend, 3 miles and 2 property boundaries north of the Langston Farms point of diversion. She had a hand-drawn map, carefully measured on foot over 2 separate days, that showed the distance with annotations. She presented Thomas Langston's original homestead filing from 1874, which referenced the use of the diversion ditch as part of the beneficial use claim. She presented a sworn statement from Abel Torres, an elderly Mexican landowner who had been farming water from the Rio Seco since before most of the current county residents were born, who confirmed that the Langston Ditch and the Cotter's Bend diversion were 2 entirely separate structures serving entirely separate properties. Abel Torres had not been willing to appear in person. He too had his reasons for caution, but he had been willing to write, and Lenora had witnessed and notarized the statement herself at the county clerk's office. She stood up there in that courthouse for 40 minutes, and her voice did not waver once. When she sat down, the room was quiet in a way that had texture to it, the kind of quiet that meant people were thinking rather than just waiting. Driscoll's lawyers requested a recess to prepare a response to the documentation she had presented. Judge Wyeth granted it. During the recess, the room dissolved into the particular low hum of a crowd processing information they had not expected to receive. Several of the men who had been standing along the walls had shifted position. Lenora sat at her table and drank water from a tin cup and did not look at Harlan Driscoll, who was speaking in close conference with his lawyers at the other table. It was during the recess that she heard a voice behind her. "Your map is accurate." She turned. The man from the back row was standing 2 feet behind her, his hat held in both hands. Up close he was taller than she had gauged from across the room, with eyes that were an unusual shade, not quite brown, not quite green, something in between that reminded her of the color the desert turned after a rare hard rain. There were lines at the corners of those eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors, squinting into sun and distance. "I know that stretch of the river," he said. "I've ridden it. The Cotter's Bend diversion is where you say it is, and so is yours, and they are not the same place." "Not even close." "I know that," she said. "I have documented it." "I know you have," he said, and something in the way he said it, without condescension, without the hedged apologetic quality she had heard in every voice that had declined to help her, made her look at him more carefully. "My name is Benjamin Keene. I have been writing survey work for the Territorial Land Office out of Santa Fe for the past 3 years. I know every diversion point on the Rio Seco between Culver and the county line. I can confirm what you have presented, and I can testify to it if the judge asks." Lenora studied him for a moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because what you're saying is accurate," he said. "And because someone in this room should say so who has no reason to be afraid." There was a directness to his manner that was neither presumptuous nor cold, just honest in the way of a man who had spent years working with measurements and distances, and had developed an appreciation for things that were simply true or simply false with nothing in between. She looked at him long enough to understand that he meant what he said, and that his offer was genuine. "If Judge Wyeth allows it," she said. "Then I'll be ready," Benjamin Keene said, and returned to his seat at the back of the room. When the hearing resumed, Driscoll's lawyers presented their response, which amounted to questioning the precision of Lenora's hand-drawn map, and suggesting that a lay person's measurements could not be considered authoritative against the survey performed by their own registered surveyor. They were smooth about it. They made it sound like a reasonable concern about evidence quality rather than what it was, which was an attempt to drown precision in procedural doubt. Judge Wyeth looked down at the table with the expression of a man balancing several uncomfortable weights simultaneously. It was then that Benjamin Keene raised his hand. There was a small stir in the room. Judge Wyeth looked up. "This is a formal proceeding," he said. "If you have relevant testimony, you'll state your name and qualification." Benjamin stood. "Benjamin Keene, sir. I hold a surveyor's certificate issued by the Territory of New Mexico, registered with the Land Office in Santa Fe. I have conducted survey work along the Rio Seco corridor since 1879 under contract with the territorial government. I can speak directly to the geographic question before this court." A silence fell over the room that had a different quality than the one before. This was the silence of a situation changing its shape. Judge Wyeth looked at Benjamin for a long moment. Then he looked at Harlan Driscoll's lawyers, who were exchanging a glance of the kind that meant they were calculating. Then he said, "I'll hear from you." Benjamin Keene walked to the front of the room and testified for 20 minutes. He did it with the calm of a man reporting what he had directly observed, without rhetoric or emotion, citing survey markers by number, referencing official territorial maps by file number, confirming the exact positions of the Cotter's Bend diversion and the Langston Farms diversion with the precision of a man whose profession was measurement. He confirmed that Lenora's hand-drawn map was accurate to within a margin that any professional surveyor would consider excellent for field work. He confirmed that the Driscoll Water Concern's 1875 filing covered the former location, and not the latter. He stated these things in the clear, unhurried voice of a person who had nothing to fear and nothing to gain, except the satisfaction of accuracy. Harlan Driscoll's lawyers cross-examined him for 10 minutes and made no progress whatsoever. Every question they asked, Benjamin answered with specifics that could be verified against official records, and he seemed not to notice the hostile edge in their voices, or if he noticed, he considered it irrelevant, which was in its own way far more unnerving for them than any defensiveness would have been. Judge Wyeth was writing notes throughout. The hearing concluded shortly after noon. Judge Wyeth announced that he would issue a written ruling within 10 days, which was longer than Lenora had hoped and shorter than she had feared. As the room began to empty, she stood at her table packing her documents back into the tin box, and she was aware of two things simultaneously: the physical sensation of exhaustion moving through her body like warm water after the sustained tension of the morning, and the fact that Harlan Driscoll, on his way out of the room, paused near his lawyers and looked at her with an expression she could not read. She met his gaze steadily and said nothing. He left without speaking. Outside the courthouse, the April sun was warm on the adobe walls, and the main road of Culver was full of the midday sounds of a working western town horses at the hitching post, the distant hammer of the blacksmith, two women talking across the street, with the animated quality of people who had information to exchange. Lenora stood on the step and breathed the fresh air and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it, something with enough substance to press against. "Mrs. Langston," she turned. Benjamin Keene had followed her out and stood at the bottom of the step, hat in hand again, the sun catching the brown-green of his eyes. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it fully, without reservation. "The judge will rule your way," he said. "The documentation is too clear." "You don't know that for certain." "No," he admitted. "But I know the law and I know what the documents say. The rest is between Judge Wyeth and his conscience." She looked at him with a directness that she had developed over the past months, the directness of a woman who had learned there was no longer any room in her life for the gentle indirections women were usually expected to maintain. "Where are you going after today?" she asked. He blinked once, as if the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. "I've been working the area for the past several weeks," he said, "finishing a survey assignment north of here. After that I hadn't entirely decided." "Are you staying in Culver?" "At the moment I have a room at the Culver Inn," he said. She nodded. "Then perhaps you'll allow me to offer you a proper meal," she said. "Tonight or whenever suits you. It's a poor substitute for what you did in there today, but I haven't much else to offer and I prefer not to be in debt to anyone." She had not intended to say that last part about the debt, but once it was out it seemed exactly right, and something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something that had the same warmth at its edges. "I would like that very much," Benjamin Keene said. She gave him directions to the farm and the time to arrive, and then she went to collect her children from Clara Tillman's house. And all the way there, she was thinking about the hearing and the documents and the 10 days until the ruling. And she was not thinking about the way Benjamin Keene had stood up at the back of that room and said she was right as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. Because if she had been thinking about that, she might have had to examine the fact that it had affected her more than she wished to admit. The farm was 4 miles east of Culver along a road that turned from dust to hardpan to packed clay as it climbed slightly into the bench land, where the Langston property sat between 2 shallow ridges. The house was adobe with a wood-framed addition Thomas had built in 1878, solid and low against the landscape, with a covered porch along the south side where Lenora grew climbing beans in summer, and where Thomas had sat in the evenings with his coffee. There was a well, a small barn, the irrigation ditch that ran along the lower edge of the property, and a view of the mountains to the west that turned colors at sunset that Thomas had claimed he could never fully describe to anyone who hadn't seen them. He had been right about that. Benjamin arrived that evening as the sun was lowering, and the mountains were doing what they always did at that hour, going from purple to rose to a deep burning orange that had no particular name in English or Spanish. He tied his horse, a sturdy gray called Prospector, at the rail near the barn and came to the porch where Lenora was watching the colors change. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked west for a long moment without speaking. "That's something," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "it is." Caleb appeared in the doorway with his watchful eyes and assessed Benjamin with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who had learned to pay attention. "Are you the man who helped Mama today?" he asked. "I spoke at the hearing, yes," Benjamin said. Caleb considered this. "She did it herself mostly," he said, with a gravity that made both adults go very still for a moment. "I want you to know that." "I do know that," Benjamin said, with a seriousness that exactly matched the boy's tone. "I only confirmed what she had already proven." Caleb held his gaze for another moment and then stepped back inside with the air of a person who has completed an assessment and filed the results. Lenora turned to look at the doorway and then back at Benjamin. "He's been the man of the family since October," she said quietly. "He takes it seriously." "He should," Benjamin said. "He's doing it well." That evening, Lenora made a supper of beans and salt pork and corn bread, with dried apple pie, because she had been keeping the dried apples for a special occasion, and this seemed like one. Me sat next to Benjamin at the table and told him at length about her doll, whose name was Rosalie, and the complex domestic arrangement that Rosalie maintained with 2 other smaller dolls whose names changed depending on the day. Benjamin listened to this with complete attention and asked several follow-up questions that Maya found deeply satisfying. Caleb watched Benjamin throughout the meal, eating his beans with quiet concentration, adding the occasional precise comment when something factual was mentioned that he could confirm or extend. The children went to bed at 8 o'clock, and the house became a different place, quieter, the lamplight softer, the sound of the spring wind moving around the eaves. Lenora poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked the way 2 people talk when they are being careful and honest at the same time, feeling the shape of each other's sentences. He told her about his work, 3 years with the Territorial Land Office after 2 years as a private surveyor in Colorado. Before that, a few years of drifting through the kind of work that the frontier offered to men who had returned from the Civil War at 17 and grown up in the decade after with the particular restlessness of a generation that had seen too much too young. He had grown up in Missouri, had come west with the general current of westward movement that carried so many men like him, not fleeing anything specific, drawn by the width of the landscape, by the sense that the country was still being written and there was space in the writing for him. "You don't have a home place," Lenora said. "It wasn't a question." "Not for a long time," he said. "I've been good at the work. I've been less good at staying." She nodded slowly. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a man who had not learned to stay was a different kind of problem from a man who never learned to leave, and she had learned enough about herself in the past 8 months to know she was not in a position to want either kind. "What will you do if the ruling goes in your favor?" he asked. "Keep farming," she said immediately. "Run the ditch properly, expand the vegetable garden, maybe try winter wheat on the lower field if the water holds. Get the roof fixed." She paused. "Keep going. And if it doesn't go in your favor," she looked at her coffee cup, "I'll figure something out. I've been figuring things out." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you have." He stayed 2 hours, which was exactly the right amount of time, long enough that the conversation felt whole, short enough that there was no awkward excess. When he stood to leave, he took his hat from the peg by the door and turned back to her with the particular contained energy of a man who is not quite done, but knows he should be going. "I'll be in Culver for another week or two, finishing the survey work," he said. "If there's anything that comes up with the ruling, or if you need a document verified, I'm available." "Thank you," she said, "for today and for tonight." "The pleasure was mine," he said, and he said it with enough simplicity that it didn't sound like a courtesy. She watched him ride away down the road in the last of the April dark, and then she turned back to her kitchen and began washing the supper things, and she thought about the hearing and the ruling and the 10 days ahead, and she told herself that these were the things she needed to be thinking about. The ruling came in 7 days, not 10. Judge Wyeth's written decision was 4 pages long, and it found in favor of Lenora Langston. It confirmed that the Driscoll water concern's 1875 prior appropriation filing did not encompass the diversion point serving the Langston farm. It recognized Thomas Langston's 1874 homestead filing and the documented use of the diversion ditch as establishing a prior beneficial use right that predated or was equal to the concern's filing at the relevant location. It ordered the Driscoll water concern to cease and desist from any further claims, demands, or actions relating to the water access of the Langston farm. The county clerk, a thin, serious man named Hopkins, read the ruling aloud to Lenora in his office, and she sat perfectly still through the reading, and then she folded her hands in her lap and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was steady and clear. She walked out into the spring day and stood on the steps of the record's office and let the sun fall on her face for one long moment. Then she went to find Benjamin Keene. He was at the surveyor's office on the north end of town, a small room he had rented for the duration of his assignment, with maps rolled and stacked against the walls and a drafting table covered in measurements. He was working when she came to the door. When she appeared in the doorway, he looked up and knew from her face immediately. "It went your way," he said. "It went my way," she confirmed. He set down his pencil and something in his expression shifted, some private satisfaction finding its way to the surface. "That's the right outcome," he said. "That's as it should be." "Yes," she said, "it is." She had told herself she was coming only to tell him the news, that it was the decent thing to do since he had testified on her behalf. She had not told herself anything else about why she had walked to the north end of town, rather than going straight to the general store for the provisions she needed. But she stood in his doorway with the April light behind her and the ruling in her tin box under her arm, and she looked at Benjamin Keene's face and thought about Caleb's watchful eyes and Me's easy acceptance, and the mountains at sunset and the way this man had stood up in a room full of cautious people and said she was right. "I would like to invite you for supper again," she said. "Not as a thank you, just as an invitation." He looked at her for a moment in the attentive way that she was beginning to understand was simply how he paid attention to things he found important. "I'll be there," he said. He came for supper 3 times that week, and then 4 times the week after, and by the middle of May he was spending Sunday afternoons at the farm, helping Caleb with the irrigation ditch maintenance in the precise and patient way of a man who understood the relationship between small, careful work and lasting results. He explained to Caleb the principles of water flow and slope and channel depth with the same seriousness he used when speaking to anyone. And Caleb, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of conversation without knowing it, absorbed it all with a fierce concentration that Lenora watched from the porch, with something that kept finding new dimensions every time she examined it. Me, who was 5 and had no complicated feelings about anything, simply loved Benjamin with the immediate and comprehensive enthusiasm children reserve for people who listen to them and do not talk down to them. She brought him Rosalie to inspect on his 3rd visit, and he held the doll with the gravity of a man receiving a significant trust, which he was. Lenora was careful. She was careful in the way of a woman who had loved deeply and lost that love abruptly and understood at a cellular level the weight of what she had. She was careful about her children, who were already finding comfort in his presence, and who would be the ones who bore the cost if his presence became absence. She was careful about herself, about the particular vulnerability of a woman who had been strong for so long that being known by someone felt almost too much, like opening a window in a room that had been closed all winter. But she was also honest, and honesty required her to acknowledge what she felt. He was a good man. She had trusted her instincts about people for long enough to trust this one. He was patient and direct and honest and genuinely curious about the world, and he was kind to her children in a way that was natural and uncontrived, not performed for her benefit, but simply how he was. He was also, and she allowed herself this acknowledgement in private, the most quietly compelling person she had encountered in a long time, not in a loud way, not in the way of men who filled rooms with their presence, but in the way of a landscape that keeps revealing something new every time you look at it. In late May, he rode back from his survey work one afternoon and stopped at the farm before going back to Culver, as he had taken to doing, and found her in the lower field examining the irrigation channel for a section where the flow seemed diminished. She was crouching in the dirt with her skirt pinned up, her hands in the mud of the channel wall, prodding at a section where a small collapse had begun to narrow the channel. He dismounted and came over without being asked and crouched beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "You'll need to reinforce that section," he said. "Pack it with clay and small stones. I can get the materials from the creek bed on the east side." "I know what to do," she said. "I know you do," he said. They looked at each other across approximately 18 inches of muddy irrigation ditch, and Lenora started laughing. It was not a polite laugh or a small, careful laugh, but a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in the chest when something strikes you as both absurd and perfect at once, and it was the first time she had laughed that way in 8 months. Benjamin started laughing too, at first at her laughing, and then at the situation itself, the two of them crouching in the mud discussing channel reinforcement as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When the laughter settled, they were both looking at each other differently. "Lenora," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every time he had said it before, or perhaps she heard it differently now that she was paying that particular kind of attention. "Don't," she said, but she said it gently. "Don't say it or don't mean it," he asked. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the mud of the channel wall. "I have 2 children," she said. "I have a farm that just barely survived a legal fight I almost lost. I have 8 months of grief that I'm still working through. I'm not in a position to be careless about things." "I'm not asking you to be careless," he said. "I'm just saying your name the way I mean it." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was behind the mountains now, the early gentle light of pre-sunset giving everything a clarity that late-day light often bestows on the desert. She looked at Benjamin Keene's face and thought about Thomas, because she always had to come to Thomas before she could come to the truth of her own heart. And what she found when she came to Thomas was not an obstacle but something more like a presence that was at peace, something that said she had loved well and could love again, and neither love was made less by the other. "I need time," she said. "Not because I don't know what I feel, but because I need to be sure I'm not feeling it for the wrong reasons." "That's a fair thing," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him carefully. "Are you not?" He held her gaze steadily. "I told you I was good at the work and less good at staying," he said. I've been thinking about that. I think I was less good at staying because there wasn't anything worth staying for, and I think I know that has changed. She stood up and brushed the mud from her hands. Then we'll have time to find out if you mean that, she said. It was not a dismissal, he understood that. He stayed and helped reinforce the channel wall that evening, and they worked side by side in the cooling air, while Caleb fetched clay from the creek bank and me provided detailed supervisory commentary from the channel edge. And by the time they were done, the light was gone and Lenora had made a decision that she did not say out loud, but that was fully formed in her, and would unfold at the pace that was right. Harlan Driscoll did not accept the ruling quietly. In June, he filed an appeal with the territorial court in Santa Fe, challenging the hearing's evidentiary standards and particularly the testimony of Benjamin Keene, which his lawyers characterized as having been improperly solicited. This required Lenora to respond to the appeal, which required documentation she already had but which needed to be organized in the format the territorial court required. She spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table preparing the response, and Benjamin sat with her on 2 of those evenings, going through the survey documentation and confirming the specifications the court's format required. On the 3rd evening, he arrived and found her at the table with a headache that she was managing through the pure force of not acknowledging it, her pen moving across the paper, with the careful determination of a woman who had 1 more hour of good work in her, and was going to use every minute of it. He sat down across from her and said nothing for a while, watching her work. "You're tired," he said. "I'm almost finished," she said. "The appeal will fail," he said. "The survey documentation is unambiguous. His lawyers know it. This is a delaying tactic, not a real challenge. It's costing me time and energy I don't have to spare," she said, "which is the point." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked up from the paper. He was watching her with the expression she had been seeing more frequently, the one that had moved past the careful professional attention into something more personal and more open, the expression of a man who was no longer trying to be discreet about what he felt. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes." "Will you still be here in the autumn?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "And at Christmas?" "Yes." She set down her pen. "Then I think you should know," she said, slowly and with the precision of a woman who understood the weight of every word she was putting down, "that I love you. I've known it for some weeks. I wasn't ready to say it because I needed to be certain it was true and not just gratitude or loneliness, and I'm certain." Something moved across his face that she had no single word for, a kind of opening, as if a room had added a window and filled with light. "Lenora," he said, and then he didn't seem to have the next words immediately, which was the most expressive thing she had seen from a man who was normally very precise with words. "You don't have to say it back immediately," she said. "I love you," he said. "I've loved you since you sat at that table in the courthouse and faced down 2 Santa Fe lawyers with your tin box and your documentation and your absolutely impractical courage." She laughed, the real kind again. "Impractical." "Practical result," he said. "Impractical odds. That's the only way those kinds of things get done," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand carefully, as though it were something he had been wanting to do for a long time and was not going to rush now that he was finally doing it. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she turned hers over and held it, and they sat that way for a while with the lamp burning and the New Mexico night outside the window full of stars and coyotes and the sound of the creek. The territorial court denied Driscoll's appeal in August. The ruling from Judge Wyeth stood. The Langston Farms water rights were confirmed in the territorial record, and Lenora filed the confirmation document in her tin box alongside the original ruling and Thomas's homestead papers and the children's birth certificates. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been taut for 8 months, not grief leaving, because grief did not simply leave, but grief finding its proper shape and taking its proper place alongside the other things she carried. The summer was the best summer the farm had known in several years. With the water rights secured, Lenora expanded the irrigation to the lower field as she had planned, and she planted winter wheat in late August that came up green and promising in September. The vegetable garden was so productive that she had surplus to sell at the Culver market, which gave her a small but real income that she applied, with great satisfaction, to the outstanding loan balance at Marcus Webb's bank, whose refusal to lend her his signature in March she had neither forgotten nor forgiven. Benjamin finished his survey assignment in July and took a position with a private survey firm based in Culver that had been looking for someone with territorial land office experience. It was not the most lucrative arrangement in the territory, but it was steady, and it meant he could work from Culver and be at the farm in the evenings instead of disappearing down the road with a bedroll and a week's provisions. He moved out of the Culver Inn in August and into a small house at the edge of town that a retired schoolteacher had vacated, and he was at the Langston farm most evenings and every Sunday, and this became the rhythm of their lives with a natural ease that felt less like something they were building and more like something they were discovering had already been there, waiting for them to arrive. Caleb allowed himself to love Benjamin with the measured progression of a serious child who was also, underneath all that seriousness, simply a 7-year-old boy who missed having a man around who took him seriously. By August, they were doing the Sunday irrigation check together with the comfortable efficiency of two people who had found their working rhythm, Caleb holding the rod and calling out the depth measurements in his clear young voice while Benjamin recorded them. And Lenora, watching from the porch with her morning coffee, had to look away sometimes because the sight of it was more than she could hold all at once without it overflowing. Me had no measured progression. Me had simply decided Benjamin was hers from the second supper onward and adjusted her life accordingly, which involved bringing him things she felt he needed. A smooth stone she had found by the creek, a feather, a drawing she had made of the mountains, and inserting herself into any conversation within reach on the grounds that she had something relevant to contribute. Benjamin accepted all of this with complete seriousness and filed the stones and feathers in a small arrangement on the windowsill of his Culver house, as though they were surveyor's instruments. In September, Harlan Driscoll made one final attempt to alter the situation, not through the courts this time, but through a private meeting request that he sent to Lenora by letter. He wished to discuss, the letter said, a potential arrangement that might be mutually beneficial. He was proposing to purchase the Langston farm outright at a price he described as generous and fair. Lenora read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and then showed it to Benjamin that evening. He read it twice without speaking, then he set it on the table. "He's not going to stop entirely," he said. "He doesn't like losing." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to sell." "I know you're not," he said. "I want to write him a response that makes that clear," she said. "Clearly but without antagonism, because antagonism would give him something to use." They worked on the response together, and it was precise and courteous and completely without ambiguity. And when it was done, Lenora copied it in her own hand and signed it and posted it the next morning. And that was the end of Harlan Driscoll's interest in the Langston farm. He had other properties to pursue and other water rights to contest, and a woman with documented legal title and a territorial surveyor who knew the land chapter and verse was too expensive a target to continue pressing. He moved on. This was not justice. Exactly, men like Harlan Driscoll rarely faced the full weight of what they had done to smaller operations throughout the territory. But it was enough. The farm was safe, and the water ran clean through the ditch that Thomas had dug, and the winter wheat was growing. The conversation about the future happened in October, which was almost exactly a year after Thomas's death, which Lenora did not think was coincidental. The body knew what the mind was sometimes still negotiating, and the arrival of October had a weight to it that year that made her more honest about what she wanted. They were walking along the ridge above the farm in the early evening, the two of them alone because Caleb had homework and Me was asleep early after a long day of significant activity. The mountains were doing their October thing, which was a different palette from spring, deeper, more amber than pink, with a clarity to the air that came with the cooling of the season. They had been walking for half an hour in the comfortable, companionable silence that had become one of the best things about their time together, and then Lenora stopped and looked at the mountains and said, "I think you should ask me." He stopped beside her. "Ask you what?" He said, and she could hear in his voice that he knew exactly what she meant. "To marry you," she said. "I think you should ask me." A silence. Then, "Lenora Jane Langston," he said, turning to face her with a directness that was the most purely himself thing she had seen him do, no containing, no measuring, just him standing in the October light saying what he meant. "I have been wanting to ask you since August, and I have been trying to determine the right moment, and I think you telling me this is the moment is probably the only signal I needed." "It was," she said. "Then I'm asking," he said. "Will you marry me? Will you let me stay here with you and Caleb and me on this farm? Will you let me be yours?" She looked at him for a long moment with all the things she was, and all the things she had been through, and all the things she intended to be going forward, and she felt Thomas's presence the way she sometimes did at the edges of important moments, not as a haunting but as a warmth, a good wish from someone who had loved her well and wanted good things for her beyond himself. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He cupped her face in both his hands the way a man handles something he is both honoring and claiming, and he kissed her the way the desert receives rain completely, without reservation, like something that had been coming for a long time and was exactly right when it arrived. They were married in December of 1882 in the small church in Culver, on a Saturday with frost on the ground, and smoke from the church's iron stove making a column of white against the blue sky. Lenora wore the only dress she owned that wasn't work clothes or funeral clothes, a dark blue wool that Clara Tillman had helped her refashion with a new collar and better sleeves, and she looked, according to Clara, like someone who knows what she wants and has gotten it, which was the most accurate description of a bride that Clara could imagine. Caleb was the ring bearer, performing this function with the solemnity of a head of state. Me was the flower girl, scattering dried rose petals with enormous enthusiasm, and then running out of petals before she was quite done, and improvising with the dried leaves she found at the edge of the aisle, which she felt captured the spirit of the thing. Abel Torres came, the old man who had given Lenora his sworn statement, sitting in the third row with his wife and his 3 adult children, all of whom shook Benjamin's hand after the ceremony with the warmth of people, acknowledging the completion of something that had needed completing. Even old Pete Morrow came, looking somewhat embarrassed and sheepish, which was appropriate. Robert Kinsley brought a gift basket. Lenora accepted it with graciousness and held no grudges, because holding grudges was a luxury of people with more spare energy than she had, and because Thomas had always said that the measure of a person's character was what they did when it cost them something, and the only people in that room who had done something when it cost them something were Abel Torres and Benjamin Keene. The wedding reception was at the farm, in the main room and out onto the porch and yard, with 2 fiddle players and a guitarist who between them knew enough songs to keep the dancing going for 3 hours. Lenora danced every dance, which was perhaps surprising to people who had watched her maintain a severe composure through the preceding months, but which would not have surprised Thomas at all, who had known from their first meeting that underneath the determination and the practicality there was a woman who loved to dance and had been waiting for music. Benjamin danced with somewhat less grace but enormous earnestness, following Lenora's lead through the more complicated figures of the square dances, while Caleb and me careened around the floor with the complete physical freedom of children at a party, and the fiddle players played Red River Valley as the last song of the evening, slow and sweet in the winter night. And Benjamin held Lenora close, and they moved together in the firelight, while their children finally ran themselves to sleep in the corner, and the neighbors gathered their coats and called their good nights, and went home into the cold, clear dark. After the last guest left and the children were carried to their beds, the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Full quiet, the quiet of completion rather than absence. Lenora stood in the kitchen in her blue dress and looked around at the room she had held together alone for a year, and Benjamin came to stand behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him with the full trust of a woman who has learned to be careful and has decided, with all that carefulness behind her, that this is worth being open for. "We'll need to make the house bigger," she said. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "Yes," he said. "In the spring," she said. "In the spring," he agreed. The winter was the best winter the Langston farm had known, and Lenora understood only gradually that what made it different was not any single thing, but the accumulation of small, ordinary things that had changed. 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1, someone to discuss the planting decisions within the evenings, Caleb's careful laughter that had finally loosened from the controlled place where he had kept it all year, Me's complete and unambiguous flourishing, the warm weight of being known by someone who was paying attention. Benjamin took on additional survey work in the spring of 1883, securing a contract for countywide land mapping that would take most of the year to complete and represented a real step forward in his professional standing. He was good at the work. He had always been good at the work. But for the first time in his adult life, the work was in service of something larger than the work itself. It was in service of a home, and the understanding of this transformed even the way he picked up his instruments in the morning. He and Caleb finished the expansion of the house that spring, adding a second bedroom and widening the kitchen, working on it in the evenings and on Sundays over a period of 8 weeks, while Lenora supervised the structural decisions and deferred on aesthetic ones. Caleb, who was 8 now and had grown several inches since the previous fall, worked with a focus and competence that repeatedly made both adults pause and look at each other over his head, with the private parental communication that needed no words. The winter wheat had been a partial success, and Lenora was planning a more ambitious planting for the coming autumn. She had also entered into a small arrangement with a neighboring farm to share the irrigation ditch maintenance costs in exchange for access rights, which improved the water flow for both parties and created the kind of local cooperative structure that made sense, and that Harlan Driscoll's monopolistic approach had always sought to prevent. 3 other small farms in the area had begun to follow Lenora's example after the ruling, filing their own prior appropriation claims and securing rights that the Driscoll water concern had been quietly harvesting for years. The legal precedent set by Judge Wyeth's ruling turned out to be more consequential than anyone had fully anticipated in that April courtroom. Abel Torres stopped by one afternoon in June with 2 of his grown sons, and the information that 4 additional farms downstream had formed an association to coordinate their water rights filings, and that they wanted Lenora's advice on the documentation process. She sat on the porch with them for 2 hours going through what she had done and why, and she was entirely matter-of-fact about it, treating it as what it was, useful information that should be shared, without any sense of having done something extraordinary. The Torres men listened carefully and asked good questions, and when they left, Abel's oldest son, Eduardo, shook her hand with a formality and respect that said more than any words would have. Benjamin, who had come home in the middle of this meeting and quietly made coffee and stayed out of the way until it was finished, found her on the porch afterward with a thoughtful expression. "You know what you've started," he said. "I started a water rights claim for my farm," she said. "Yes," he said. "And now other families are doing the same thing and the information keeps moving." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains. "Thomas always said the land was only as good as what you could build on it together," she said. "He meant the farm, but I think it was true of bigger things too." By the autumn of 1883, Lenora knew she was expecting a child, and she told Benjamin on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the November wind outside and the warmth of the iron stove filling the room. She told him without preamble, watching his face, and she saw something pass through him that was deep and quiet and wholly real. A man receiving news that reaches him somewhere below the place where prepared responses live. "We're going to have a baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt beside her and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment with those brown-green eyes that she had been looking into for a year and a half now, that she knew as well as the mountains. "You're all right?" he asked. "You're well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I am, in fact, very happy about it." He kissed her temple and then her cheek and then her mouth, slowly and with the full presence that was one of the things she loved most about him. And she put her hand on the back of his neck and held him there for a moment, her husband, the man who had stood up in that courthouse and said she was right, who had stayed. They told the children the next morning. Me's response was immediate and comprehensive excitement, involving several plans for the new baby that she had apparently already developed on approximately 30 seconds' notice. Caleb's response was a long pause followed by the question, "Will I have to share my room?" Which, when answered to his satisfaction, produced a careful smile that was the most purely joyful expression Lenora had seen on his face in 2 years. The pregnancy was healthy, and Lenora's vigor was such that Benjamin had to remind her, repeatedly and without particular success, that the second trimester did not mean she should be expanding the irrigation channel single-handed. She expanded a section of the irrigation channel in the second trimester. Benjamin helped, because arguing with Lenora about physical work was less productive than simply being there to make sure the work was done correctly. The baby arrived in the late spring of 1884, a boy, born on a morning in May when the light was clear and the desert was running its brief annual green. They named him Thomas James Keene, Thomas for her first husband, James for Benjamin's father, and Keene because this child was wholly theirs together and had a right to that name. He came into the world with a great deal of determination and a respectable quantity of noise, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and he was, as these things go, entirely perfect. Caleb was 9 now and stood at the edge of the room with an expression that Lenora would remember for the rest of her life, not jealousy, not displacement, but something more complex and more moving. A young boy understanding that the world had expanded to include something new and finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that it felt like abundance rather than subtraction. Me, at 7, loved Thomas James with the immediate and total commitment she brought to everything she loved, and appointed herself his primary protector against all threats perceived and imagined, which at this age included loud noises, strangers, and in one memorable incident, a grasshopper that had gotten into the house, and that she dispatched with a broom handle and a war cry that woke the baby and frightened the cat. They kept a cat now. Benjamin had arrived home one evening in the fall of 1883 with a gray tabby kitten in his coat pocket, found under the feed store porch in Culver, and this had been received with such unanimous approval by both children that the cat's continued residence was never in question. Me named him Marshall because she had recently attended a conversation between Benjamin and the county marshal that had made a deep impression on her, and Marshall, the cat, adapted to the farm life with the pragmatic ease of cats everywhere. The farm was doing well. The 1884 growing season was the best they had known, the winter wheat successful, the vegetable surplus enough to establish a regular market arrangement with the general store in Culver. Benjamin's mapping contract for the county had been extended into a second year, and had led to a recommendation that opened the door to a more substantial survey contract with the territorial government. They were not wealthy. They were, by any reasonable measure of that time and place, doing well. Land they owned free of challenge, water rights that were documented and secure, children who were healthy and loved, a marriage that had more strength in it every season. In the summer of 1885, Lenora received a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, which turned out to be an invitation. A committee was being formed to advise on the development of a territorial water rights code, a formal legal framework that would standardize the prior appropriation system and reduce the kind of predatory practices that the Driscoll Water Concern and operations like it had been able to exercise in the absence of clear statute. The committee wanted representatives from working farm families with documented water rights experience. Someone at the land office, Benjamin suspected it was the registrar who had handled several of their filings and had been quietly impressed, had put Lenora's name forward. She read the letter twice and set it on the table. Then she looked up at Benjamin. He was watching her with the expression she knew meant he already knew what she was going to do and was deciding what he thought about it. It would mean travel to Santa Fe, she said, 2 or 3 times, maybe more. I know, he said. The children and the farm, Clara Tillman has offered before, he said, and Caleb is old enough to handle most of the daily work. I would be here. She looked at the letter again. Thomas would have said go, she said quietly. I know what I think, Benjamin said. I think you spent 8 months of your life making it possible for families in this county to hold their water rights, and I think someone at the territorial level has noticed, and I think the best use of that is exactly what this letter describes. He paused. And I think you'll be extraordinary at it. She went to Santa Fe 3 times over the following year, each trip lasting between 4 and 8 days, and she was indeed extraordinary at it. She brought to the committee table the same quality she had brought to the Culver courthouse: precise documentation, clear reasoning, and the authority of a person who was speaking from direct experience rather than theory. The other committee members, most of them men with more formal education and less practical knowledge, found her initially surprising and then indispensable, which was a pattern Lenora was becoming accustomed to. The Territorial Water Code that emerged from the committee's work in 1887 was not everything she would have wanted. Political compromises meant that some of the protections for smaller operations were weaker than they should have been, and the enforcement mechanisms had gaps that operators like Driscoll would certainly find and exploit. But the foundational principles were sound, and the prior appropriation doctrine was enshrined in a way that made the kind of blanket intimidation the concern had used against her and others considerably more difficult. It was a start. The country was still being written, as Benjamin had once said. The writing took time. She came home from the last Santa Fe trip on a September afternoon in 1887, and the farm was exactly as she had left it and also somehow richer, the way a place looks when you have been away from it long enough to see it fresh. The wheat was tall. The irrigation ditch ran clear. The mountains were doing their late summer purple, different from spring, more layered, with the first hint of autumn silver at the peaks. Benjamin was in the lower field with Caleb, who was 12 now and had his father's height and his mother's eyes, and a steadiness about him that made people stop sometimes in the middle of conversations and look at him, as though they were seeing something they needed to understand. Thomas James, who was 3 years old and called himself TJ with considerable insistence, came running from around the barn at the sound of her horse and hit her at approximately knee-height with the full force of a small person who has been waiting for something and has run out of patience for the waiting. She swept him up and held him against her, and he immediately began telling her, at high speed and with many tangential additions, everything that had happened in her absence, including an incident with Marshall the cat that she was not sure she was fully understanding, but which appeared to have involved a significant quantity of water. Benjamin came across the field with Caleb when he saw her arrive, and he came to her and kissed her in the proper unhurried way that made Caleb look at the middle distance with the expression of a 12-year-old experiencing parental affection. And TJ, still in Lenora's arms, said, "Papa, Mama is home. with a tone suggesting that this was information of the utmost importance that Benjamin may not have registered. "I see that, son," Benjamin said. He kept his arm around Lenora's shoulders, and TJ squirmed to be transferred to Caleb, who received him with the automatic easy competence of an older sibling long accustomed to this, and Lenora leaned into her husband's side and looked at her farm and her children and the mountains. "How was it?" Benjamin asked. "Good," she said. "Hard and good." She paused. "The code will pass. It's not everything, but it's real." "Then it was worth it," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." Me came out onto the porch at this moment, 9 years old and full of news, her dark hair escaping from its braid in approximately 11 places, her face alight with the specific excitement of a child who has been waiting to report something. "Mama," she called, "we have something to show you. We found something really interesting." TJ knocked it over, but that part isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is what? Lenora called back. "Come and see." Me commanded, with the authority of a person who has long since ceased to question whether her commands will be followed. Lenora laughed, the real kind, the deep kind, and felt Benjamin's arm tighten around her for one moment, a brief hold that said everything it needed to say, and then they walked together toward the porch where their daughter was waiting to show them something interesting. The years settled into the farm, the way the land absorbed water slowly, completely, until they were indistinguishable. Caleb grew into a young man of 17 by 1892, working the farm with a knowledge of the land and water that was as much instinct as learning now, thinking about studying engineering at a school back east in a few years, which Lenora and Benjamin saved toward with the same careful discipline they applied to everything that mattered. Me was 13, conducting herself through early adolescence with the full force of her personality, which was considerable, interested in everything, afraid of nothing, already in possession of very clear opinions about water rights law, local politics, and the correct way to make corn bread. TJ was 8 and had been their particular surprise in every way, not in temperament, which was expansive and joyful and direct, but in the depth of his interest in things. He had Benjamin's love of precision and measurement and Lenora's instinct for the practical application of information. He knew the depth of the irrigation ditch in every section by heart. He could read a surveyor's map at 8. He had been asking questions since he could talk that usually required 2 adults to answer fully. In the spring of 1893, Lenora discovered she was expecting again, and she told Benjamin on the same evening she became certain of it, sitting at the same kitchen table where they had sat on so many evenings and worked through so many things together, the lamplight familiar and good. He was 43 now, with more silver in his hair than brown, and the lines around his eyes had deepened with years of outdoor work and something else. The particular lines that come from a life of genuine expression, from having felt things and shown it. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had been receiving from him for 11 years, the attention that saw her fully and found her more than sufficient. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He smiled, the real kind, the whole kind that she had seen the first version of in his face on a spring morning in 1882 when he had walked to the front of a courthouse room and confirmed what she already knew, and she reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you," she said. "I want to say it clearly sometimes, not just take it for granted. I know you love me," he said. "I know it every day." He turned her hand over in his, the familiar gesture that still had all its meaning. "But I am very glad you say it clearly." The new baby was a girl, born in October of 1893, and they named her Clara Ruth Keene Clara for their neighbor and longtime friend Clara Tillman, who had been a quiet, steady presence through 11 years of their life together, and Ruth for Benjamin's mother, whom Lenora had met once on a trip to Missouri, and who had embraced her with the complete warmth of a woman who recognized in her son's wife exactly the kind of person she had hoped he would find. Clara Ruth arrived in the world with a disposition that was sunny and alert, looking around at everything from her very first hour as though she was conducting an assessment and finding it satisfactory. Caleb, 17, held his youngest sister with the gravity of a young man who understood that the world had just added something to his custody. Me, 13, was immediately and utterly in love, which was entirely characteristic, and also in this case, entirely appropriate. TJ, 8, examined his new sister with the focused interest he brought to all significant observations, and then announced, with the tone of someone delivering the conclusion of a scientific review, "She's a good one." The farm had expanded over the years, carefully and sustainably. A second field in full production, a small apple orchard that Benjamin and Caleb had planted in 1889, and that had produced its first real crop in 1892. The irrigation ditch had been extended and improved, the water rights long since secured and confirmed and woven into the territorial record as immovably as bedrock. The house had been expanded twice, warm and solid, and full of the accumulated life of a family that had put real work into it. The territorial water code was being improved upon, and Lenora had been asked twice more for consultation, which she gave with the same precision and practical grounding she had always brought to it. The movement she had inadvertently helped to start smaller farms understanding their water rights and filing to protect them, had continued through the territory, and had spawned similar movements in neighboring territories. She did not think of herself as the cause of these things. She thought of herself as a farmer who had needed water and had found the law that supported her need and had used it, and if other farmers had drawn courage from that, she was glad. She was not a revolutionary. She was a woman with a farm and children, and a husband and good clean water running through the channel Thomas had dug by hand in the summer of 1876. She thought about Thomas still, as she had always known she would. Not with the raw grief of those first months, but with the warm, faithful grief of someone who is still grateful for what they had and has found a way to carry it forward rather than down. She had kept his name. The children were still Langstons and Keenes together, in the way the farm held both its history and its present. She had told TJ about Thomas before he was old enough to understand and then told him again when he was, and she told Clara Ruth too, when Clara Ruth was old enough to listen and understand. "You come from people who built things with their hands and loved this land," she told them. "That is who you are." Benjamin understood this. He had always understood it. From the very first evening he had sat at her table and let Caleb tell him, very seriously, that Mama had done most of it herself. He had not needed Thomas to be absent to make his own place here. There was room for everything, as there always is in a life that is genuinely lived. One afternoon in the fall of 1895, 13 years after the water rights hearing, Lenora stood at the edge of the lower field and looked at the irrigation ditch running clean and full in the October light. TJ was working beside her, 10 years old now, and already thinking about the ditch the way an engineer thinks, talking about improving the channel gradient to increase flow efficiency. Benjamin was coming across the field from where he had been measuring the new section they were considering adding to the orchard. Caleb was away in Albuquerque at school. Me was in the house helping Clara Tillman, who had come for a visit, put up the last of the autumn preserves while Clara Ruth, 2 years old, operated underfoot with the comprehensive helpfulness of a toddler who believes her assistance is essential. The mountains were doing their October thing, the deep amber and purple and the silver peaks, unchanged from every other October she had stood here and watched them. The sky above was the particular blue that the southwest held in autumn, so clear and deep it seemed less like sky and more like another country visible from a great distance. Benjamin came to stand beside her and TJ looked up at his father and then went back to his calculations about the channel gradient, the way he always did, acknowledging the important people and then returning to the important problem, which was in its way the most Langston and Keene thing about him. "Good day?" Benjamin asked. "A very good day," Lenora said. He stood beside her and looked at the mountains and the field and the ditch running clean in the late afternoon light, and she could feel him taking it in the way he still did sometimes, with the attention of a man who had spent enough years not having this to know what having it was worth. "Do you ever think about where we would be if that hearing had gone the other way?" he asked. She considered this genuinely. "I would have fought it in the territorial court," she said. "And if I'd lost there, I would have found another angle. There was always another angle." He looked at her. "You would not have given up." "No," she said, "but I am glad I didn't have to fight alone." He reached for her hand, the familiar gesture, and she took his. And they stood together in the October light, with the mountains going their particular colors, and the ditch running, and TJ talking to himself about channel gradients, and the sound of the house behind them, full of the voices of women, and the small certain sounds of a young child being cheerfully underfoot. This was the thing that had come from all of it. The months of grief and the courthouse and the tin box and the documents and the man at the back of the room who had stood up and said she was right. Not just the water rights, though the water rights were real and essential and had made everything else possible. But this, a farm that held its history and its future in the same red soil, children who knew where they came from and who they were, a marriage built from two people choosing each other with full knowledge and no illusions, and the particular piece of a life that was hard and good and wholly, unreservedly worth living. The ditch ran on. The mountains held their colors against the evening sky. And Lenora Langston Keene stood on the land that was hers and looked out at everything she had made of the life that had been handed back to her, and she found it, in all its complicated wholeness, more than enough. She squeezed her husband's hand. He squeezed back without looking away from the mountains, because he felt it too, the fullness, the completion, the simple, profound fact of being exactly where they were supposed to be. TJ looked up from his calculations and found his parents standing together in the field in the golden light, and went back to his numbers with the quietly satisfied expression of a 10-year-old boy who understands, without yet having the words for it, that home is not a place so much as a thing that certain people build together out of stubbornness and love and the willingness to stay. The last of the sun caught the water in the ditch and turned it briefly to fire, and then the light shifted and the water was itself again, clear and cold and running, the way it had always run, the way it would continue to run, steady and uncontested, feeding the land that fed them all.